Why was QE set up in 2012 but for to prevent a treasury bond default? It wasn't for financial stimulus. It was for intensive care for the treasury bond and permanent welfare for Wall Street banks. You're looking for warning signals. You're looking for black swan. It's an armada. It's not one or two that are cited every few months. And put them all together, and it's an armada.
All right, guys, a special thanks to my patrons and a shout out to this video's sponsor, the Shepherd's Ancient Diet. It's the only biblically inspired step-by-step weight loss system that works to completely transform your body. What if you simply followed the nutritional recommendations found in the Bible, guys? Eating more foods that contain healthy fats. It could slow down the aging process, rejuvenate every cell in your body, and lose weight, all without stepping foot in the gym. Now, you can accomplish many things that will lead to a more healthful life without ever feeling hungry. Imagine cranking up your metabolism to where it's burning fat all the time when you sleep and when you're eating fulfilling, nutritious, delicious food. The idea for the Shepherd's Ancient Diet is from Christina Wilds, the creator of the Shepherd's Code. And for over 20 years, she's worked in fitness and nutrition, and she's never seen a single system, program, or diet that comes close to the life-transforming principles laid out in the Ancient Diet. So please watch the free video that I'll link below and find out how to use the Ancient Diet at theancientdiet.com. That's theancientdiet.com, where you can learn the biblical steps to weight loss. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in. And after a long departure from SGT Report, it's wonderful to have back the one, the only Jim Willie from golden-jackass.com. Jim, how are you? Welcome back.
I'm doing fine. It's good to be on. So much has been happening the last few years, and now we've got, I think we can only classify it in a few ways that are very clear. We got a bond market crisis that's blooming. We've got a global dollar rejection that is accelerating. And we got economic decline that seems to be encouraged by the banker policies.
Yes, we do. And as you know, we also have the former UN Undersecretary General calling for a one world currency. Jose Antonio Ocampo is actually right on time to make the case for a one world currency. And we're going to talk about that. I want to talk to you about Basel III. But first, Jim, we got to frame this up for the audience. I think in service of the fact that you and I haven't spoken in so long, but we've both been sounding the alarm about the U.S. dollar, the impending crisis, the global debt crisis, derivatives. We have to remind people why this conversation and the facts we're about to share are so important. There's a little something called normalcy bias, and I want to read the definition for folks. Normalcy bias is a belief people hold when considering the possibility of a disaster. It causes people to underestimate both the likelihood of a disaster and its possible effects because people believe that things will always function the way things normally have functioned. And Jim, as with a tidal wave, a tsunami, there are warning signs when an impending tsunami is about to claim you and your family from the beach. The water goes out and the dummies run in to collect seashells while the informed among the crowd run for higher elevation. Jim, what are some of the warning signs we're seeing right now about the impending death of the dollar, the euro, and global fiat currencies?
Okay, before I answer on the signs, let me comment that I have no normalcy bias. When I started the newsletter, I detected that we were fast. That was back in 2004 and 5. I detected that we were breaking away from normalcy very quickly because we had a housing bubble that Greenspan encouraged. We had mortgage bond fraud with the MERS title base deep fraud, multiple usage of the same secure stream income on mortgages. We had underwriting stupidity. We had zero income approved mortgages. So I started right out of the gate, Sean, in 05, saying that there is no normalcy and we're working our way toward a housing market crash and a mortgage finance crisis. And I got that right. I actually talked about the Lehman breakdown about 3 or 4 months before it occurred. And I also talked about the Fannie Mae breakdown about 3 or 4 months, maybe a year before it occurred. So what I've got is the opposite. I call it an abnormalcy bias. Nothing is normal. And just take into consideration that since 2001, we've had no successful U.S. government foreign policy initiative. Not one. Not one. So what I've been describing in analogy form is this abnormalcy is in the form of a constant flow, an armada of black swans. And Talib, I think is his name. Talib was the inventor, the originator of the term black swan. And what I've noticed is that every month we got a new black swan. We had just a very weird, I have a very tickly face. I'm sorry about that, but you know, I scratch my eyes, I scratch my nose, I scratch my chin. I do it a lot, and I'm not a cokehead, so you know, leave that alone.
No worries. It's allergies, I bet, you know, and stay away from those vaccines because they'll only make your allergies worse.
I haven't had a vaccine since I was 5. I'm one of the original who had about 5, and that was it. Measles, mumps, polio, etc. That was it. I'm done. Now you got to have 30 to stay in school. It's ridiculous.
They want to make them mandatory too, just like they want to make it mandatory that you hold dollars and avoid gold and silver.
Yeah,
I'm kidding, but they'd love to if they could.
I know. And there's another mandatory thing. To be on national U.S. financial news network, you have to talk about the recovery that's in progress. You cannot mention recession. If you do, you'll never be invited back. Okay, so what are the signs? You want signs for what's not normal, for what's breaking down. You need an hour to discuss and even mention all the signs. But okay, I wasn't prepared for mentioning signs. I'll just go off the top of my head. We have the Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI is now a $11 trillion initiative and conference table with 100 countries involved, and memorandum of understanding, 11 trillion. And I guarantee you, almost none of that will have 2 factors. Almost none. Almost no dollar trade as a result, and almost no U.S. firms involved. They're going to be some token firm, like General Electric is a token firm that's in there, and maybe ExxonMobil might be a token firm. But they're mostly infrastructure, so it's, you know, don't consider energy firm. All right, the BRI initiative, that's one. The warning sign of the combined triangle in Shanghai, the gold, oil, RMB futures contract. They all work together. So Russia can sell oil to China, receive RMB, convert it immediately to gold, and take it home by way of the Sberbank in Beijing, and then straight to the Kremlin. On another side, another usage of that triangle in Shanghai, the gold trade note will be hatched. I got a very firm but indirect indication from the Voice that the gold trade note is now in usage. The gold trade note is a gold equity. Just think of something like a deposit put forth of say 5, 10, 15, 20%. I don't know the exact. There might be various types, but I'm thinking it's going to be a minimum of 10 and a maximum of 20%. You put forth that gold, and it will replace the U.S. Treasury bill, say in an oil shipment. So imagine China is buying oil from Iran or Saudi Arabia. Those are the 2 nations that I think are going to get this thing really off the ground. Now add in Angola, which is not a small player anymore. Add in maybe Nigeria, which has never been a small player. And introduce the gold trade note, which will then replace the Treasury bill. And you've got yourself a very powerful signal there. Here's another one. China expanding the Silk Road. Now, it's got a lot of names. It's called the New Silk Road, Silk World Order. I mean, Belt and Road, One Belt, One Road. Now it seems the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is the acronym, is the title that is most prevalent that you see in the press. China just completed a trip to Italy. I mean, among other places, they went to Italy and to France. And I think the significance came from those 2 countries. But let me just rattle off to you what ports in Italy constitute a big signal. Ravenna, Genoa, Trieste, and Sicily had Palermo. The Chinese are on a buying spree, and the Italians would like, I think, at least a minimal non-controlling interest by the Chinese in all 4 ports, and perhaps controlling interest in 1 or 2. I don't know. Now, bear in mind, the Italian government was told by the U.S. government, back off. We don't want China. They're actually a competitor, and we consider them, somewhat of a hostile commercial partner. And they got their labels, and it's all crap. It's all silly. It's all hostile. It's not conducive to global economic development. What does the United States sell? We sell weapons. We sell pharmaceutical drugs. We sell bonds. We sell vaccines. We sell McDonald's franchises. In other words, we sell diabetes. What does China sell? A complete spectrum of commercial infrastructure, layouts, businesses, infrastructure, port facilities, railroads, community centers, hospitals.
Stolen intellectual property.
And, well, the Chinese are trying to paint themselves as very solid players in global commerce. And I like to praise their successes, but I also like to mention that for 30 years, they've been thieves of intellectual property, IP. It was reported in the 90s, and I was shocked to read this when I was younger. The Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, just call them Chinese military. They formed a corporation for copying without license all the Microsoft products. And they expanded for music, like all kinds of Hollywood and entertainment industry music. And they expanded to software, applications. And the United States couldn't touch them on copyright infringement, intellectual property theft. We couldn't touch them. And actually, some Western financial analysts would say, oh, it's really good for spreading the Western commercial trademarks and labels. It's really a good thing, and they're going to expand their economy, and they'll end up being a buyer of American goods. Yeah, right. It's the other way around. My gosh, they got a 20 billion monthly trade surplus with the United States. Okay, going on. There are many, many more. It's just the Shanghai Gold Exchange is an enormous signal, because they're selling gold there. Oh gosh, I mean, it's such a novel concept that a gold market sells gold and not just a paper contract. But the volume is like 10, 20 times greater, maybe greater, much greater in Shanghai.
Well, let me ask you, Jim, because you wrote in your latest here, guys, you can get this at golden-jackass.com, golden-jackass.com. Go to the public area. And of course, there's special stuff there for members only. But in the public area, you write that the SGE, the Shanghai Gold RMB window, it assures the death of the LBMA. And I want to talk about that too, the death of the LBMA. And I got to talk to you about Basel III, what the implementation of Basel III means. But yeah, the Shanghai Gold Exchange is a LBMA killer.
It is. Before I get to the gold killer, I mean the LBMA killer, let me mention the exchange for physical. You're looking for warning signals. You're looking for black swan. It's an armada. It's not one or two that are cited every few months. It's a couple every month, and put them all together, and it's an armada. Several months ago, London set up the exchange for physical. They wanted to complete the corruption loop. On the sell side was the paper contract, the futures contract for gold. And you might see in a 24-hour period, 9 or 12 months of global mine output sold. I mean, it's absurd what's going on with the gold market. Now, several months ago, London set up the exchange for physical. And I've done some good homework on that, and I've consulted with some very smart people about this, and we concluded that the exchange for physical was set up in London to prevent a COMEX default because they were that close. They didn't have a lot of gold, and they were getting overwhelmed by contracts. So they set up a phony delivery system in London whose volume is tremendously bigger than their vault size. So they're delivering more than they have. Okay, it's just corrupt to the core. That's a big signal. Now, Basel III is a big signal. I put out a public article, Sean, a little while ago. I think it was about a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago. And it said that there are 3 factors that are going to be working on gold. And these are all additional signals. It's QE forever. QE started about 2 years ago with a tightening, a reversal. And recently, Powell, the new Fed chairman, announced we're going to make it permanent policy. Okay, why don't they just come out? Why don't the pundits come out? Why don't the financial press come out and say, wow, we've got QE forever now? Why was QE set up in 2012 but for to prevent a treasury bond default? It wasn't for financial stimulus. It was for intensive care for the treasury bond and permanent welfare for Wall Street banks. Okay, so I reason that we have 3 factors: QE, the SGE, and the BIS. I mentioned QE. I think we're going to expand QE to cover, this is not a signal evident right now, but it's what's coming soon. We're going to expand QE to cover corporate bonds. And the precedent has already been set by the Euro Central Bank 2 years ago amidst flack. And while Europe did the corporate support, the United States, the U.S. Fed, I call it U.S. Fed because their home is in the United States. The U.S. Fed announced, well, more like got caught in crude oil and stock market support. So you already got corporate bonds, stock market, and oil market support. I think the U.S. Fed is going to have corporate bond support because big problems are coming. Okay, you want to sign? How about General Electric, fallen angel, going to triple B after being considered the premier financial corporation in the United States when I started this newsletter in 04 and 05?
Right.
There's a big black swan. Okay, so if there are going to be more fallen angels that go to triple B, but we have now $2.8 trillion worth of triple B debt in the form of corporate bonds, and it's going to fall to junk. I got one colleague, I call him Sky Crane, that's what he wants to be called. Sky Crane says, we're going to have $1 trillion that fall to junk from triple B status. And it's going to happen in the next year, a year and a half, 12, 18 months. Okay, that will be more black swans. I think the Fed's going to cover corporate bonds. The third thing that's going to push gold, first is QE, second is the SGE. They actually move gold. When the Australians send gold to China, it goes through Hong Kong to cover their tracks, but it ends up being sold in Shanghai. I can't go without telling this quick story. I got a phone call from The Voice in 11, October of 2011. And he said, Jim, 1,000 tons per month will be shipped from London to China each and every month for a period of time. And I learned by the end of 2013 that it had quit at the end of the year. So from March of 2011 to the end of 2013, it was about 30 months, maybe November or October of 2013. It was 30 months. He said, Jim, it's over. Because I asked him in January, is it still going on? He said, it ended a few months ago. It was 30 months, Jim. And I said, 30,000 tons? And he said, 30,000 tons was forcibly removed with Interpol help and crack team of lawyers to remove 1,000 tons a month from London. And I said, on what grounds, sir? And he said, because the London and European crew improperly used Chinese gold as the basis for the entire European monetary union. And they were forced to reverse it. So when people say, gosh, I think the Chinese have more than 10,000 tons. And then you have astute analysts come out and say, like McLeod, well, if you do your math from the 1970s to the recent years, you can make a very easy argument that they've moved 25 to 30,000 tons from the West to Shanghai. Okay, well, then you get reports of the White Dragon elders and the family and the society, all the different White Dragon groups, and reports are just constant. That they've got 110,000, 115,000, 117,000 tons of gold. Okay, the Chinese have a lot of gold. So do the Russians. I think the Chinese have much more. When you have 5,000 years of combining kingdoms in China, the word China, the name, comes from their version of king. And Qin, Chen, Chuang, Chung, Sang, they all mean king. It's like royal families combining together, and they pool their gold. They've been doing it for 5,000 years. Okay, the third big factor to push gold. The first is QE, second is Shanghai Gold Exchange, the third is BIS. It's the Basel III rule. Mm-hmm. And I just reading before the interview began here, I was reading from the Saker. The Saker is rumored to be a Russian. I don't think there's a lot of firm information about his identity. I respect him. I think he's excellent. He and Pepe Escobar always float my boat and capture my attention. But the Saker believes that Basel III is a major signpost, landmark event where the Basel crew, it's actually the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. They have made a declaration. It's the BIS, Bank for International Settlement. The BIS, it's often just called Basel because they're located in Basel. Basel has made a new rule that gold will be counted
as a tier one asset.
Tier one asset.
As good as cash, right?
As good as cash. And, you cannot escape the significance of this.
Right.
I hearken back to a 1990 conflict between their chairman, the Basel BIS chairman. His name was Zijlstra. He had a conflict with Rubin as a Treasury Secretary and with Greenspan. This is the mid-90s. He had a conflict because the Basel bunch, I call them the boys, the Basel crew, the Basel boys, Basel cabal, the Basel gang, they set all the banker rules. And I'd like to know under what contract, but that's an argument for another day. Zijlstra argued that gold must be considered tier one cash, and Rubin and Greenspan said, not on our watch. The dollar will never be subordinated to gold. And for some reason, the Basel gang said, okay, we won't make gold a tier one asset. And that enabled all the crises that followed. I'm talking about the 99 build up and melt up, Tech Telecom bust, the 2008 Lehman crisis, the need. It was not considered a crisis at the time, but when we went to 0% and it didn't really solve anything, and then we went to QE, that was to prevent a treasury bond default because buyers evaporated. You can't lower the interest rate and expect buyers to fill the room on a treasury auction. That's just nonsense. Okay, so that was a big event. And I think it also enabled the crisis that we have today. I call it the systemic Lehman crisis. And others call it I don't like the name, they call it the everything bond crisis. Why not call it the panorama bond crisis, or the pan bond, or the complete bond, or the total bond crisis? What happened, Sean, in 2008 was lousy underwriting in the mortgage market for the housing. And it had lots of sidebar structures like the MERS, the Mortgage Electronic Registry System, I think it's called, MERS, where they had unbelievable fraud that's never been prosecuted. No fines, no crimes, no nothing. They just kind of disbanded it because they got caught using the same mortgage stream in multiple bonds. The entire mortgage bond market was corrupted. Okay, we had the Lehman crash. We had the Fannie Mae crash. We had the, how should I call it? The corrupted rupture and takeover of AIG and the sacking of it in order to take control of credit default swaps for the benefit of Goldman Sachs, which got 100 cents on the dollar. Not talked about too much. And the entire episode was prompted by the Chinese, who were reneged upon with about a $5,000 gold lease, and they decided to abandon the Fannie Mae bonds by declaring they were going to give emphasis to the treasuries. Okay, all this stuff happened with a focus on mortgage bonds and synthetic derivatives and credit, CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, and CDO squared, which was leveraged CDOs. Oh my gosh, they made a mess. Everything they did for the mortgage bond, they duplicated for the treasury bond and for the euro bond, and for what they did was they opened the door for corruption of corporate bonds too. What we've seen in the last 3 years is a tremendous amount of corporate bond issuance that did not go for business development, but instead went for executive compensation packages and stock options and stock buybacks. And now the piper is singing the tune, and it's all a very big mess. General Electric had the same kind of abuse, and some of their abuse was cited in their debt downgrades to BBB. They didn't invest in their companies. They padded the executive compensation, and now they're having business woes and a fall down in their business activity and their growth. And furthermore, their debt is unmanageable, and there's a new term out. This is another big signal, the plethora of zombie firms. Now, there are various definitions, but the one I choose to link onto is that their cash flow, the free cash flow, does not cover their debt obligations. So they need to issue more debt or acquire commercial debt in order to manage their current debt.
Right. Sounds a little bit like the U.S. government.
Yeah, well, the U.S. government is the worst example of all. They engage in pro forma accounting. They allow one-off items. Okay, let me give you an example. Hurricane relief, California fires. There's a big amount of funds that's created, and it's not considered part of the deficit. You got one-off items all over the place. You got all kinds of Pentagon appropriations that don't appear
right
on the budget deficit. What I like to do is not to look with focus, well, except to prove it's a lie. I look at the government accounting for the year, where they'll say, oh, it's $580 billion deficit this year. Look at all this accounting and all the details and all this hard work that we put into declaring the balance sheet and the loss for the year. A lot of hard accounting work. Okay, what they've done is it did a lot of massaging and bullshit gimmickry. What I do is something much more simple. Okay, at the end of last fiscal year, what was the total debt? The end of this fiscal year, what's the total debt? Mm-hmm. Let me subtract the two, and I got 1.2 trillion. Where did I go wrong?
Mm-hmm.
I went wrong only if I paid any credence to their pro forma accounting.
Well, can I play something for you? Let me play this soundbite from Alan Greenspan. And then I got to ask you about Basel III again as it relates to central banks hoarding gold, derivatives, what it means to banks like Deutsche Bank. But let me play this soundbite for you to back you up. I want people to understand and remember, when we talk about normalcy bias, guys, I know it feels like nothing has changed, especially if you're a buyer of silver and you've only seen it sit at 15 forever or go from 30 to 15. And we'll talk about silver with Jim and get his thoughts on it. But I got to play this soundbite. This is from 2005. It's a Senate Banking Committee hearing with Alan Greenspan. And guys, in 2005, the U.S. national debt was $7.9 trillion. What is it today, Jim? 20? 21 trillion?
22.
22 trillion. Listen to this soundbite, guys. It's a minute long, and Alan Greenspan says, we can provide all the government purchases that you need. We just cannot guarantee the purchasing power of the dollar.
Do you still believe that we should maintain the fundamental principles of Social Security as you did in 83?
I think we should maintain the principles of Social Security, but I think the existing structure is not working, and that until we can construct a system which creates the savings that are required to build the real assets so that the retirees have real goods and services, we don't have a system that's working. We have one that basically moves cash around, and we can guarantee cash benefits as far out and at whatever size you like, but we cannot guarantee their purchasing power.
All right, I'll pause it there. That's so important, guys. Now, Jim, what it reminds me of is the fact that we have $22 trillion in stated debt. That doesn't include Social Security. That doesn't include Medicaid. That doesn't include unfunded promises and liabilities, which exceed probably 100 or 200 trillion by some estimates at this point. So for people listening, the warning signs that Jim has described, this is akin to a tsunami that's coming, and the beach has receded as far as the eye can see. And most of our friends, neighbors, and colleagues are out a mile, mile and a half or two collecting seashells, and they have no idea that a tsunami is coming, and it's going to be far larger than any of us expected.
When you get to comments by Greenspan, well, first of all, what he was saying was we can manage all the debt, but we're going to have to inflate the debt away and undermine the currency, the dollar.
Right.
So its purchasing power will diminish. And a gallon of milk will not be $2. It'll be $3, then $4, then higher in price. So we can't guarantee the purchasing power. Okay, well, fine. Oh, golly, isn't that progress? No, it's not progressive at all. I mean, Zimbabwe is an expert at inflating their debt away. Do they get a big star on their forehead for that? No. The United States is Zimbabwe. QE was unsterilized hypermonetary inflation of the worst kind to cover our debt without removing money from the banking system. In other words, unbridled, unchecked inflation on the monetary side. And we saw the supposed benefit of a rising stock market. We saw the supposed benefit of a rising bond market. It's all bullshit. When Greenspan made his speeches, I focused on something that he commented on about the derivatives. And he called the derivatives a wonderful example of American ingenuity working toward the financial engineering goal. And he said, we have successfully, he said this around 2002 and 3, we have successfully securitized and protected through vehicles in offloaded risk. 3 years later, 4 years later, the subprime bond explosion occurred and made a big fat liar and goofball out of Greenspan. I consider Greenspan to be a brilliant man who ruined the U.S. financial structure by following the British banker orders, and his reward was knighthood. We did not successfully offload the risk. We created a gigantic mess with mortgage bonds, mortgage finance, related synthetics, and a nightmare with credit default swaps, and we had to overtake and capture AIG, the lawsuit for which has never been properly resolved for Hank Greenberg. That was a theft of his company, and he's very angry. But he decided a while ago he's not going to fight it anymore because he's, what, close to 90? And he didn't want to get murdered. Okay, what else did Greenspan do? He urged the entire U.S. economy to rework and reset their mortgages. He said, it's a good idea to rework your mortgage, redo it. If you got a high mortgage, bring it on down because we're going to bring down the mortgage rates and we're going to make that a nice incentive to help the economy. Okay, it sounds good, but it's tinkering. It's tinkering with the market. And it was the beginning move. That and QE were the beginning moves toward what I call Reich economics, R-E-I-C-H, not R-I-G-H-T, Reich, as in Fourth Reich. There are many aspects to the Fourth Reich economics. It's the requirement to talk about the sluggish economy growth, the requirement to talk about ultra low jobless rate of 5%, when that's the percentage of people collecting unemployment. Shadow government statistics with John Williams is very competent in declaring that we have a 23% unemployment rate. Reich economics demands that you talk about ultra low price inflation, which is a benefit to our society and maintains our purchase power and benefits our elders and all those savers. It's a bunch of bullshit. Okay, the true inflation rate. I just read a quote, and I included it in the March newsletter, a quote from John Williams and the shadow government statistics. We've only had 2 quarters since 2005 with positive growth in GDP. So where's the economic growth? We don't have any. There's a fellow named Chapwood who came up with a consumer price index in 2015, and it was an amazing basket of 500 items in 50 U.S. cities. Now, of course, you're not going to get the tiny cities in Indiana and Utah and Florida and in Georgia. That's okay. In Vermont, that's okay. You're getting a really good indicator, though. 50 cities, 500 items. And the inflation rate was the biggest in New York and Los Angeles, the annual inflation rate. But he had a consensus, and there was a consensus, the average or median, whatever he went by. It was always around 8.5% every year. And he estimated, he said the overestimate of the U.S. economy size is 22%. In other words, because of the falsified CPI, our actual U.S. economy after the last 18 to 20 years is 22% smaller than what we claim it is. That's an astonishing Reich economics counter argument. You've got to talk about how the whole world is very dedicated to the dollar. Okay, that's another Reich economics pronouncement. You got to talk about how the United States pulls its weight and offsets all the imports with global expansion and global investment. It's really bullshit. We have, oh gosh, I forecasted a year ago that we're going to see a ballooning. I didn't put an actual mark on it. I'm honest about my forecasts, and I'm honest about my errors. 2 years ago, we had about a $650 billion, $560 billion trade deficit. Then it went up to close to 700. Now it's tracking at 920. Now let me put this into perspective. This is another signal that I regard as very important when you put it in the context of gold standard. Let's suppose we fix the gold price at $1,300 per ounce. Now we say we're going to back the dollar by gold, and let's not get caught up in how much gold. Now let's focus on the $560 billion trade deficit we had 2.5 years ago. Okay, that older 3-year-old, 2-year-old trade deficit translated to 13,000 tons of gold lost. That's how much gold is required to produce and put on the table, a lot of tables, $560 billion worth. Now we're tracking at 920. It's not quite 50% bigger. I did some simple math, and now we're at 19 to 20,000 tons of gold lost if we go to the gold standard. Sean, I've been making a point, before we go back to Basel III and its impact, I've been making a point that we got 3 requirements to get back on track and to avoid the third world. And I don't say this lightly. I've been talking about the U.S. as a country, as a nation, being under threat of falling into third world status. I've been making this comment for 5 years. It's almost guaranteed by QE. QE is not a stimulus. It's a slippery slope to the third world.
Right.
Okay, the 3 requirements are simple. We must pay off a good portion of the 22 trillion in debt. We must source a good portion of 10 or 20,000 tons of gold. We must reindustrialize the nation with an emphasis toward export in order to alleviate, reduce significantly, or eliminate the now $920 billion trade deficit. If it gets to $1 trillion, then you can say we have twin trillion deficits, the federal and the trade. You can't work your way out of that. That's a dead end. That's a dead end alley where you fall into a big pit.
Can I ask you something?
With tar.
Let me ask you something. Can we write off a good portion of the Federal Reserve debt? See, the thing is that these central banks are showing us now that they value gold as real money with Basel III. They're returning gold to a tier 1 asset. Meanwhile, people around the world are waking up. Take, for instance, the people in Italy. The argument is being made that the gold belongs to the people, not the bankers, as Italy moves to seize gold from the central bank. Why don't we just swear off some of this debt owed to the Federal Reserve? And I agree with you, some of this other debt should be paid off. But to do that, we'd have to control our spending, and politicians aren't going to do that. So as we return to talking about Basel III, I can see what it means to central banks and how they trade with each other and how they value each other's assets. By the way, when I say central banks, I may as well say Rothschild. But what does it mean to the big, giant criminal banks like Deutsche Bank, for instance, and their derivatives book? Will it mean anything, or will they just continue to be able to paper over their debt by, I guess, getting QE from governments and from their own taxpayers to cover up these bad bets of these criminal bankers?
Well, let me talk about default first. I got information from a fellow, I called him Cato. I'm no longer in contact with him. Not a good guy, okay? He provided me some information. He's not a good guy. I'm keeping my distance. He told me back in 2014 that there are numerous countries that were exchanging their treasury bonds at a 35% discount for the local currency. They were getting out. The requirement was never to talk about it, never to make it put it in the press, never to have a quotation in the press. Just do it, deal with it, and get it done, and that's that. No press. Okay, that's a 35% debt restructure, Sean. That's a default. I argue that the U.S. Treasury bond has been in default in a minor way, in a small channel, for 4 to 5 years. Okay, now, it would be a wise move to do a 60% write-down on the U.S. government debt. What's 40% of 22 trillion? That's 8.8 or 9 trillion. That could be more managed, especially if we increase the gold price, especially if we not source the gold, if we create a better U.S. industrial base. Very poorly understood is when we went to become the dollar as the global reserve currency and treasury bonds were in the banking system across the world, it was almost a guarantee that we're going to lose our industry because foreign nations were going to finance our debt and they needed cash to do it, which industry provided them for through their export trade. Okay, now, if we have a 60% debt write-down, what would the impact be? We're talking about a bond haircut. What would the impact be? Well, for all those dumbass countries that didn't get out of the treasury bonds, now, who did? Russia. Who did? China. I argue, Sean, that China might have almost no U.S. Treasury exposure. I know you see on the tick report 1,000 billion. Okay, fine. Is U.S. financial data ever falsified?
Right.
Okay, it's not only falsified, but it's encouraged for Wall Street banks to preserve their power. Now, does that mean that the tick report is falsified? How about if we put an asterisk there for all the swaps to offset their exposure to the treasury bond, to the dollar, for China? We don't know what their swaps are. And it could very well be that a lot of their swaps were done in Deutsche Bank, and that's why it's not going to be dissolved. I'm talking about Chinese swaps, currency swaps, petrodollar swaps, all kinds of swaps to reduce their dollar exposure, so that when gold is repriced way up and the treasury bond is, I hate to use the word defaulted upon, when it enjoys its massive haircut, the Chinese will not take a hit. That's my point. I got into an interesting discussion about 3 or 4 years ago with a good buddy of mine. He said, Jim, you know, if you add up all the, if you consider all the Chinese investment in Africa and East Asia and you know, Iran, and if you add them all up, my gosh, they might not have much dollar exposure. And I said, wait a minute, no, you can't do that, because I've already done that exercise. What's their Nigeria exposure? Well, they put in about $3 billion last year. What do they do for Angola? Maybe not quite as much. What do they do in Djibouti? Well, that might have been $1 billion. What do they do in Rwanda and Kenya? Well, that may be a couple billion. I said, add them up, my friend. What do you get? 20? You don't get 1,000. And you sure as hell don't get 2,500, which is what their exposure was to the treasury bond back then. $2.5 trillion. It's 2,500 billion. So their African adventures and African commercial investment, it's significant, but it's nowhere near like 200 billion. It's not even, I don't think it's even exceeding 100 billion. Okay, so what would be the damage if they did a big haircut on treasury bonds? Okay, what they would do is say, you got to exchange your treasury bonds. Okay, this is all hypothetical, but now it's not so unlikely as it was 3 years ago when I first talked about it. And that's the nature of some of these jackass forecasts. People say, oh gosh, Jim, you're an idiot for saying such a thing. I said, wait a couple years, you fool, and get back to me with an email, you fool, when Germany starts to flip east, you fool. The big damage is going to come to treasury bond owners in a big way. And that means central banks across the world. They're going to be told, bring in your treasury bonds and exchange it for gold bullion. And I don't know who's going to do it. I've got some guesses and some beliefs. I think the BRICS Development Bank might turn out to be a Chinese-sponsored facility for exchanging treasury bonds and using the Shanghai Gold Exchange for the purpose of gathering gold bullion with a severe motive to replace the treasury bonds in their banking system. There could be a few different BRICS development banks. There might be a new facility created with the Belt and Road Initiative with a German blessing that enables transfer of sovereign bonds like Euro bonds and Treasury bonds and Japanese government bonds and converting them to gold, and they might all use the Shanghai Gold Exchange. The Shanghai Gold Exchange is the gold paper mark killer. What else would be the damage? It would be the houses that have been engaging and abusing the interest rate swap derivatives. Now, if I had to guess, I would say out of the $1 trillion of US government debt, maybe a third of it or more is bought by US institutions like the pension funds, mutual funds. A small portion, like 10%, is bought by individuals, and the entire remainder is bought by the interest rate swap derivatives, like 60% interest rate swap derivatives. I noticed that there was a lot of strain 3 and 4 years ago by the bond, what do they call them? The bond dealers, the Wall Street bond dealers. They experienced stress because they were obligated to buy bonds, but they couldn't find investors. That stress was very important on the bond dealers as a signal that the treasury bond market was failing. And QE put that to rest. After QE, the bond dealers had a buyer at the Fed by way of the Exchange Stabilization Fund that managed for Wall Street at JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs all the IRS derivative, interest rate swap derivative. I don't want to get into their structure. It's short-term versus long-term, coupon versus cash, and they just take great advantage of the ultra low interest rate for a near zero feeder price. And you could say, gosh, Jim, didn't they ruin the interest rate swap derivative complex, that machinery, when they started raising interest rates? No, because they found methods to offset with a different policy that neutralized the interest rate hike, like reverse repo, like interest paid with excess reserves. Okay, lots of little tools that they have. They call them tools. They call them, items in their arrows in their quiver, and they're all to disrupt and pervert the bond market. So if you have a haircut with this default of the Treasury bond, all the different houses like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs could face ruin unless there's some kind of a little gigantic effluent sewage pipe out their backside, like maybe a guarantee with the new central bank or a guarantee for God knows what. It's too big. Okay, remember we used to hear that there were $1,400 trillion worth of derivatives, and in the last several years it's been whittled down to a mere 700 or 750 trillion in derivatives. I argue that the bulk of that was the dismantling of the petrodollar derivatives, the linkage between crude oil and all the major currencies. I argue that what's left is predominantly interest rate swap derivatives and other very weird exotic foundation type derivatives that I don't know a whole hell of a lot about. But the interest rate swap derivative is what the bag holders are holding. When the bond haircut comes, you're going to see lots of banks just go dead. It could be Société Générale of France. It could be Deutsche Bank, but I think Deutsche Bank has a lot of dirty laundry from a lot of powerful people. It's been called the Papa Bush money laundering bank. They've got solid connections to Qatar. It could be two different French banks that go down. It could be a competitor to Barclays in London that goes down. I actually think that in the next couple of years, we might possibly see, it's not a firm forecast, we might possibly see a couple of Wall Street banks go dead. And I think Wells Fargo might be one of them. It looks like they're a designated target based on some of the events that have happened in the last few months.
Right. They've had some very concerning computer glitches and all sorts of problems just recently. And it does beg the question, is it a dead bank walking? But when I think of the big criminal international banks, Deutsche Bank is at the top of the list. But Wells Fargo in this country, certainly domestically, is a big concern. And probably one of the chosen few big banks that is on life support maybe, but still allowed to survive at the grace of the Fed and the international banking cabal. Can I ask you this, though, as it relates to Shadow Stats and John Williams' work? He's been predicting hyperinflation of the dollar for a very long time. I think he thought it would start in 2016. Here we are sitting in 19. We haven't seen it. Is it because of velocity? What is the reason we haven't seen the dollar hyperinflate yet, or the yuan, or the yen? And when will we see these currencies begin to hyperinflate?
I think you have to define what hyperinflate means. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a term that's put out there a lot, but do you
Well, I guess what I'm saying is, how is inflation still kept at bay in this country? Inflation levels are...
Well, you mentioned money velocity has
survivable.
gone way down. They've created firewalls to prevent all the Wall Street infusion of QE funds, preventing it from going on to Main Street, which means the business sectors. That's very cleverly, brutally done success, a big success.
And it's a blessing, frankly. I've talked about this with others.
I'd rather have more recognized inflation than what we have.
Yeah, but a hyperinflationary scenario is a doomsday scenario. Just look at Venezuela. I mean, we don't want to go there, and I don't care how much physical silver or gold you have, which, by the way, gets me to silver. I have to get your thoughts on silver because I've had recent guests on saying, look, it's been demonetized. You can wish it not to be the case. It's not going to change the facts, though. Silver is not the place to be. It's gold.
When I started the newsletter, I had a general principle of 80% silver, 20% gold. I don't care about platinum. I reasoned that the gold silver ratio would eventually, well, first go nuts, but then eventually come back in line. And whenever you saw a push in precious metals, the gain for silver was triple that of gold. There has been a lot of talk about gold being the preferred item, but it's really not that simple. It's not that simple at all. I asked The Voice 4 years ago. I said, sir, tell me, with your billionaire clients, what do you recommend as a ratio? He said 90% silver, 10% gold. And I said, why is that? What is your justification? What do you tell them to convince, like, you know, a billionaire guy in Hong Kong, or a billionaire in Singapore, or a billionaire Arab? What do you tell them? And he said, the shortage for silver has been acute. The demand is going to be enormous. The crisis will first show itself with silver, and eventually silver will be recognized, if not as a monetary metal, for its powerful industrial role. I said, okay, do you get a lot of objections from your clients when you suggest 90% silver? He said, no, they follow my lead. And Jim, your 80% silver is just fine, leave it there. So I continued in this vein. I want to get to Wells Fargo. I got some comments. I'm making a mark there. About a year ago, I was in another conversation with him, and I said, any update on silver and gold as you know, the bimetallic standard? Because you said for years and years that both will become monetary metals. And he said, a decision has been made in very high places. And I said, before we go on, could you explain to me what the high places are? And he said, it's all part of the conferences having to do with the global reset. Now, it's very little known, but in January of 2014, over 100 nations were signatories to the global currency reset. And it might have been a test balloon that the United States followed, because the following month, the United States and Israel created the Ukraine war. They sponsored the Maidan, I don't like calling it a massacre, the Maidan riots, the Maidan event, the Maidan coup. Of course, they hired police on the rooftops to kill people, and little known is the thousands of amphetamine vials that were handed out just to create chaos. Okay, so I asked him what event was behind the silver decision, and what is the silver decision? And he said the global reset basically made an agreement that gold would become the monetary metal and silver would become a highly protected and treasured industrial metal, which would also serve as a nucleus for numerous different next generation energy and other technology systems, advanced technology systems. And I was thinking, oh gosh, you know, maybe superconductor, low temperature. And he said, Jim, that's just the tip. That's one of 50 different things that I'm referring to. So he basically said silver is going to become the energy and technology standard metal, and gold is going to be the monetary metal. Now, that does not mean that the gains will be only in gold. It means the gains will be in both. He went further a couple months later to tell me that the silver market will eventually become unique, protected, and sequestered, although still fair and just. And I said, wow, you got to explain that. And he said, imagine all the gold, I'm sorry, gold is going to be monetary. Imagine all the silver vaults, all the main like 1,000 ounce bars and the 10-kilo bars of silver. All the owners get contacted, and by agreement, they must store their silver bars in several different global centers in their vaults and make it available for the special clients. And I said, who are the special clients going to be? And he said, it could be national organizations for creating energy and technology centers for disbursement across the commercial sectors. And I said, tell me about price under this structure. And he said, they would be organized vaults, but not to steal. It would be to house, to store. And you would be guaranteed, you silver owners, the market price. But the market would not be a standard kind of market. It would be a sequestered and an elite and protected kind of market where supply and demand would rule. That's the key. And I said, what kind of price? And he said, minimum 200, more like 400 per ounce silver. And I said, and the benefit would not be stolen from the owners? No, no. They would be rightful owners in these vaults. There would be of an official nature to guarantee that the planet has adequate silver supply for something extraordinarily valuable with incredibly unique qualities that are required in numerous advanced technologies, including a lot of different next-gen energy systems.
All right. Well, they could have half of my silver right now at 200 to 400 an ounce, but I want the other half just in case we hit hyperinflation. Okay, so that said, I think that's very interesting. And you wanted to say something about Wells Fargo. Now, as we wrap this up, Jim, we are running out of time. Let's finish this out with Wells Fargo, and we'll get you on next time to talk about the EU, Brexit, the future of the euro, etc. So much to talk about there that we didn't get to this time. So your final thoughts here on Wells Fargo, your concerns.
I contacted a couple of California colleagues and a couple of smart California clients. And I got also a couple of followers who I don't say, you got to be a hat-trick client. You got to pay me in order to keep contact, communicate. No, I just contact all my special people in California. I said, what's going on? And I got some word back. I'd rather not mention who it was who helped me, but to understand. But my current understanding is that the Chinese had a gob of assets in Wells Fargo. And I believe that Wells Fargo as a bank had collateralized and leveraged that asset. And the Chinese pulled some of it. So they basically wrecked, I don't want to say completely wrecked, they impaired the financial standing of Wells Fargo. Furthermore, the Chinese have a habit, they have a practice that they've done many times. They make a deposit of 10 billion in treasury bonds, and they borrow 100 billion against it, and then they go shopping across the United States for commercial properties. And now after many years of doing this, which the United States could not stop because the big banks were holding treasury bonds, and that's considered a AAA pristine asset upon which you can leverage and borrow against. The end result was after several years, the Chinese own roughly 30% of commercial buildings in 20 to 25 major US cities. That's a big slice. Okay, there's more about Wells Fargo. It was reported from these sources, and I had to bring it all together, and what was this all saying? Because there was bits and pieces and other and there was a lot in common from the comments that I got in reply. It appears that Wells Fargo is the first bank in the Wall Street crew, okay, they're not Manhattan, the first Wall Street bank to go under. And we tried to figure out what caused it to go under. It was bad loans. It was maybe bad mortgages from the fires. We don't think about the impact from thousands of lost homes. San Ramon alone had 1,000 lost homes.
Right.
If you have tens of thousands of lost homes, Who's the major mortgager?
Yeah, by the way, just a side note, PG&E, Rothschild owned fires. I just got to say that. PG&E was directly responsible for many of those fires, the ignition of those fires. And every time there's a global disaster for humanity, dig just a little bit and you may find the name Rothschild behind it.
I think you'll find it in 90% of the disasters, including airline crashes, including the one about 3 years ago. Let's see if I can find the name of it. There's a name of a chip. I've got notes on my wall. I'm looking feverishly.
You're going to mention the flight that disappeared, right?
Yeah, there was a chip that the Rothschilds bought. I cannot find it.
I'll look too. I reported on that as well. It's that the missing flight that's never been found.
Yeah, well, there was a name for the chip. Anyway, forget it. There was a super chip that was an anti-hacking, multi-embedded processor chip, super advanced. And there were engineers on board one of the flights, and it went down supposedly. I think it did not go down. I think it went directly to Diego Garcia, where the engineers were all captured.
It was MH370, a Malaysian flight, and the chip I think you're referring to links back to a supposed patent on a Freescale semiconductor chip.
Freescale, that's it. Freescale chip. Yeah. That's the name of it, Freescale chip. Sorry to interrupt you, but that's the name of it.
You're right. There's a lot more to that story that has never, ever come out. But the point here is dig a little deeper, and the name Rothschild comes up time and time and time again.
Right. They had an auction for the Freescale chip, and it was forbidden for competitors to bid in an open auction. And Rothschild bought it for $13 billion. And I reason that if it had been in an open bid situation, arena, it might have gone for triple or 5 or 10 times greater price. And I actually suspect that the Freescale engineers, some of them might still be working in Diego Garcia, and a couple of them might have been murdered just to motivate the others. This is what they do. They don't have a conscience.
Yeah, and just to back you up a little bit, this is a story or an article from Brian Lambert, and I think the story went like this. Not sure if he has it right or if you do or if the truth is somewhere in between, but Rothschild inherits Freescale semiconductor patent as the result of all the engineers that died or vanished on flight MH370.
Wow. Now,
it just never ends with these people. By the way, they own just about every central bank on the planet, Jim. So if the central banks are buying and hoarding gold and considering gold equal to cash at this point, I think people ought to pay attention to that.
Let's talk about, as a closing remark, what Basel III means for the central banks. Many of them, like the Fed and the Euro Central Bank, are in an insolvent situation. Any kind of a haircut to the Treasury bonds or the Euro bonds will make them very negative and very insolvent, to the point of being declared bankrupt, even though that term really doesn't apply because liquidity is an issue. Insolvency plus lost liquidity equals bankruptcy. They're not going to lose liquidity. So if that happens, these central bank franchise banks are going to be in a position where they have to load up on gold and follow the Zylstra 1990 declaration of their way out. And he called it the long-term plan, the long-term solution. He forecasted, he anticipated that many of these central banks within the Rothschild system would go insolvent. So he had a plan. He said they make gold a cash item, make it equal to the bonds that are favored, and they start loading up on gold to the point that after a while they have a significant amount of gold, and then they increase the gold price tenfold. We're talking about $13,000 gold. It'll be done by a declaration. They might allow it to be, a steep ascension and path. I don't know how they're going to do it. I think it's going to be a step function. I'm a mathematician type. I think it's going to be, okay, we're just going to let it jump to 2,800. Okay, now we're going to let it jump to 4,200. Months pass, now we're going to let it jump to 5,600. Months pass, now we're going to let it jump to 7,000. So it'll be an orderly spike. And a lot of people will be discouraged. Like they have a second jump and up to 5,000. There's going to be a lot of publicity, propaganda, that it might come back to 3,000. So they're going to get some idiots to get in there with shorts. And that's going to be to create an equilibrium. And they're going to ruin them all. And they're going to jump up to 7,000. And then they're going to repeat the process and say, you might have a pullback to 5,000. I think we've got our destination. In the private rooms of the BIS in Basel, they're going to have all their plans laid out. And I think it's going to be something like $10,000 to $15,000 gold. And when we get to anywhere in that range, these insolvent central banks are going to have restored financial health. We have to disbelieve their bullshit propaganda all along the way. It's not going to stop under 10,000. The Zylstra plan is plain, tenfold, is minimum requirement to get them out of trouble. If their treasury bonds, like just consider the Fed, they got about 4 trillion. I think 3 of it is in treasury bonds. If they take a 30% haircut, they're going to lose $1 trillion. How do they gain the $1 trillion and more? Well, Fort Knox at 1,300 is worth $500 billion. They need $500 billion worth to go up tenfold. That's $5 trillion. Okay, this is the kind of numbers that you could use on a napkin to get an idea of what's going on. These central banks need thousands of tons. And I put out this article saying the QE, Shanghai, SGE, and BIS are going to be 3 factors to push up gold. I didn't put a timeline on it. And I got a couple of clients say, Jim, when do you think that the Basel III rule is going to take effect and cause a big lift in the gold price? I said, don't really know. Could be 6 months that we start to see some big movement. And now the Saker is on record as saying later this year he expects an $1,800 gold price. Okay, I didn't say later this year, but that's very reasonable. I think in the next couple of years, we're going to see way over $2,000 gold price.
Right.
And I think it's going to be pushed by the central banks. And they're not going to be buying it at a higher price after they publicize their plan. Now, if you want to go out and buy 100 television sets for your new hotel, are you going to forecast it before, broadcast it before, or are you going to maybe talk down the market so you can go out and buy a bunch and not pay up on the price? The central banks are going to talk down gold for a little while longer. And it's really a matter of how much China is going to tolerate. China is bigger than Russia in gold, much bigger. China and Russia are working together on managing the lift in the gold price. I think the central banks with the Rothschild gang, by the way, their middle ranks are almost, I don't want to say entirely, but are 80 to 90% wiped out. Their middle ranks of the Rothschild gangsters, their whole team and hierarchy, their execution manager, not to kill, but to execute plans.
Well, they've definitely been exposed. And I'll back you up with that by saying that with the death of George H.W. Bush, a big hole was left in that puppeteer racket, the Rothschild pyramid scheme with the death of George H.W. And Dave Janda and others have reported that there was nobody to fill that vacuum in the Bush
Where's
family.
Baby Bush, Sean?
Yeah.
He hasn't been seen in 2 months.
Yeah, well, and he wasn't ready for that job. I don't think anybody in that family was quite as evil as the father and the grandfather Prescott. Hey, Jim, we got to wrap this up here in just the next couple minutes, and I want to get you back on because obviously when we talk, we plan to go 45 and we do 90. You're a great source of information, and can you please remind people how they can sign up for the newsletter? I know if they go to golden-jackass.com, there's a free public site where we can see your latest articles, but tell people briefly about the membership site and what they can get.
Okay, the same site has a subscription page, and it has a login for the members, and they enter a big room where it has, at least going back to now January of 2018, we now have 15 reports in the new site. I'm still running at an 80 to 90% correct forecast rate, and Saudi being trashed by the United States and Germany flipping east, and the introduction of the gold trade note, and the inevitable death of the LBMA and COMEX, and the launch of the new Scheisse dollar. These are all coming to pass. I didn't talk about the Scheisse dollar much, but I think when the United States is forced to have a gold-backed dollar, we're going to have a fake one. We're going to have one backed by deep storage gold and tungsten bars. And we're going to falsify the independent audits. and we're going to get away with it for maybe about a year or a year and a half or two. But the hat trick letter is the publication. This month, April, will be issue number 181. It's a single report now as of January. It's never short. There's so much happening. It's the hat trick letter. We've been around a while, got a tremendous correct forecast record. I give a lot of credit to my jackass colleagues. They all contribute, some more than others. Some are quieter, and when they do speak, I listen. Like one particular, he helped me to understand the exchange for physical because he researched it completely and then shared his research with me. So that's the kind of stuff that gets handed to me. But I invite people to go golden-jackass.com and take a look at the articles. There's a little button right there that says articles and interviews. And it's a newsletter that has a fixed price. And inflation has raged and everything has gone up in price, but I've not raised the price of this newsletter. It's $110 for 6 months. I've not raised the price since 2009. I got a lot of comments. Jim, you should really go up to $250 a year. Well, that's fine. Thank you. You should start your own newsletter. I like to keep it steady because the economy is not in great shape. So you got to offset the price inflation by being fair in price. And that's what I do.
All right. Well, guys, check out the new mobile-friendly version of golden-jackass.com. Our guest has been Jim Willie. Jim, we're going to be sure to get you on again, okay?
Oh, it'll be a pleasure to be on again, Sean. I apologize for the absence.
Well, I'm glad that we were able to reconnect, and we will do so again in the future. And friends, for those of you who are listening, go to the top of sgtreport.com and click through to our sponsors, SD Bullion, sdbullion.com, if you want to get some physical precious metals for your portfolio, silver or gold. They provide both, and free shipping on orders over $99. Thanks so much for listening, guys. And until next time, God bless. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you very much. Bye.
All right, guys, and thank you so much. And for real news 24/7, visit us at sgtreport.com, the antidote to corporate propaganda and lies. Bye-bye.
Antarctica is very much a paranormal hotspot. Something is going on down there. The United States definitely has a year-round presence there at this point. But the question is, what's going on underneath the ice?